Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today we want to talk about one of those possible consequences. We talked about extinction, but another possible consequence of natural selection is speciation. As those adaptations stack up and species become more adapted to their environment because of these environmental pressures, you start to get populations that change and become isolated from the other populations, resulting in new species. And so the first thing we probably ought to do is define species. So a species, one of the big definitions of species, so you've got genetic definitions of species too, and so you look at the genetic complement, you can say, okay, this is one species based on these genetic changes. But for a long time, and one of the still big sort of accepted definitions of species is that they are a group of interbreeding individuals within a population, that population or populations, that they're reproductively isolated from other populations. And there are some real problems with this definition, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And that is why we have the genetic component adding into this. So when you really are defining species, you're kind of looking at balancing these two ideas of an interbreeding population that's reproductively isolated and a sort of unique genome, right? Those combined, because there's some problems with this. Potentially interbreeding, well, if two populations aren't interbreeding, how do you know if they can interbreed? And so there's some issues with that. And again, we'll talk about this later on. But basically, speciation is the process of new species arising through these evolutionary processes, specifically natural selection and sexual selection. And sexual selection we're going to talk about later on. And isolation. Right? So selection and isolation make species. So which of the following would not be representative of a different species? House mice and field mice, right? That is a house mouse and a field mouse. An eastern diamondback rattlesnake and a western diamondback rattlesnake, a polar bear and a brown bear. Brown bears are also known as grizzly bears, or a cougar and a mountain lion. So this also illustrates the problem that I was talking about in the classification notes about species names, right? House mice and field mice, those are different species. They are not the same. They have two different binomial nomenclature, okay? Eastern diamondback rattlesnake, western diamondback rattlesnake, they are isolated from each other. They have genetic differences. They are different species. Polar bears and grizzly bears, they are different species. Now here's the catch though. Even though they are different species, they are genetically similar enough that they can actually interbreed. They typically don't. They are usually isolated by climate, right? So they're geographically isolated. But in instances in which they are not geographically isolated, they have interbred together. Now, the question is, are their offspring viable or not? Because this is the other component, remember, of species, is that the offspring has to be viable, meaning it can have its own offspring as well. And so even though mules are a new animal, remember that mules cannot have babies with other mules, right? Horses and donkeys make mules, mules don't make mules. So that's kind of the situation with the grizzlar, which is what I like to call the polar bear grizzly combo, okay? And we don't know because the only one that we've ever seen so far was killed, right? So we're not sure. Now, a cougar and a mountain lion, those are both puma concolor, right? And so they are the same species. They are just common names for the same species. That population stretches all across the United States, and even though you have different names, they are still an interbreeding population across the United States. Okay, so species, not interbreeding populations, right? Okay. So adaptation, we talked a little bit about adaptations, but I want to just review this idea of what are some adaptations that you might see. Physiological adaptations are going to include things like reproductive changes, defensive structures, so like horns and things like that. And I'll show you some more defensive structures when we start talking about predator-prey strategies. Resource exploitation, that's how do you get your food. Think hummingbirds have really long beaks. Protective coloring like camouflage or mimicry, which I'll talk about later on too. And then also sexually selective traits. traits. But then there are also behavioral adaptations, and that's going to be how you get the food, right? So the hummingbird, the beak, that's a physiological adaptation for food acquisition. But this little monkey right here is actually cracking nuts open, right? So it can eat it. That is a behavioral adaptation. Defense, right? How you actually respond to a predator or a threat. Living in groups is a behavioral adaptation. There are lots of reasons animals do that. Parenting behavior, how you actually get your offspring to survive. And then mating behaviors, think courtship dances, stuff like that. Well, again, we'll talk about sexual selection specifically later on, okay? Now, we know that catastrophe is really important for speciation. We talked about that when we talked about the rare earth theory. Some things that you want to think about when you're thinking about why catastrophe is important is that major events allow for new niches. New niches allow for new pressures. Okay, new pressures allow for new species. And you may end up getting bottlenecks and losses of genes in populations and species, and that will also lead to speciation quicker because you have this kind of limiting factor. And then something else is that generalists during catastrophes, generalists are organisms that can access lots of different food sources. Okay, so like humans are generalists, coyotes, raccoons, right? Hummingbirds are specialists because they can only do the nectar. Generalists will survive better. Okay, panda bears versus black bears. Black bears are thriving, panda bears are endangered. Panda bears eat only bamboo, black bears will eat everything that they can get their paws on and stick into their faces. Okay, generalists will survive, but specialization typically occurs in the period following a catastrophe. This is that adaptive radiation we've been talking about. It's the specialization, and that specialization will push populations to be isolated. That isolation results in speciation. Okay, so if you have any questions about this, make sure you ask them in class. And here's your next question. Traits that are lost will evolve again. True or false? That is false. If you have a trait that goes away, like legs in whales, it is not going to come back again in the same form. Now, does that mean that you couldn't have a new structure that forms leg-like features, right, and eventually become legs? Maybe, but they won't arise from the same structure. It won't arise from the same structure typically, okay? So that's a very important thing. So essentially what we see is that when you lose something, you don't get it back. Now, there are vestigial things and there are atavisms, right? But that's because in those atavisms, that genetic complement in some ways is still there. And so you can get these sort of like weird throwbacks, but it's an anomaly. It's not coming back, okay? Once it goes away permanently. Once it goes away permanently, it's not coming back. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about adaptive radiation and speciation. There are really two types of speciation. There is allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And every time we've talked about geographic isolation, like Arctic foxes and red foxes, grizzly bears and polar bears, they are separated by climate. You may have something that's separated by an ocean, you know, mountains, whatever. That is allopatric speciation. They don't have the opportunity to breed, and so genetic changes stack up. Okay, now here's the thing though. Sometimes you get those genetic changes in populations that are in the same area, and this is sympatric speciation. So you have some single ancestral group that gives rise to multiple specialists, right? And this is what happens in adaptive radiation, and Darwin's finches are a really good example of this. You have some finches that go from the mainland to the Galapagos Islands, right? And there are all these niches, and so there are all these pressures, and the variation that you see within the offspring of those populations allows them to exploit both physiologically and behaviorally new food sources, which gives you a rapid push to a separating of groups. Because if I can eat big seeds, I'm probably going to mate with another bird that can also eat big seeds, right? And we're going to eat big seeds together. We're going to be hanging out together. If I can eat cactus, I'm going to hang out on cactus. and I'm going to mate with somebody that can also eat cactus, right? And so you get this big shift, but you're all in the same ecosystem area, right? And that's sympatric. So allopatric is geographically isolated. Sympatric is where you have you give rise to multiple specialist forms of a species because of open niches. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about changes in populations. You can select for traits and you can select against traits. Okay, and that's a very important difference. There are 3 types of selection, right? The way selection goes ultimately, and we'll talk about some other types too in just a second, but when we're talking about, like, if you have a bell curve of something, right? So let's say that you have phenotypes in mice. I don't know why you would talk about phenotypes in mice, but let's say that you have the original population is this color, right? But then you also have blonde mice and you have dark mice, right? When we talk about these 3 types of selection, stabilizing, directional, and disruptive or diversifying, okay, you're talking about the direction that the population is going to go along that bell curve. Okay, so stabilizing, this for instance is stabilizing selection. It's going to bring the population, you're going to select either for the middle or against the extremes of the bell curve. So in this case, you have selected against the blonde mice and against the dark mice because maybe the habitat is like this color. Blonde mice are easy to see, dark mice are easy to see, they all get eaten. So in this case, you're selecting against these guys and for the middle. Okay, so stabilizing brings you closer to that middle phenotype. And remember, a phenotype is the appearance. Okay. We actually have stabilizing selection in the human population in both birth weight and height. We have a wide range of heights, but if you are too small, there are usually physiological problems that go with that. Okay, if you are too big, there are physiological problems that go with that as well. And people who suffer from gigantism oftentimes have other problems, and many of them don't live past like 30, 35. Okay, birth weight is also a really big deal. Okay, so if your baby is born too small, if it's under like 3 or 4 pounds, right? Well, if it's under like 4 pounds, that it's going to be sickly and it may not survive. If it's over like 13 or 14 pounds, it's very difficult to get the baby out. And so babies now that are like 23, 24 pounds, those babies are born by cesarean section because you have to be able to get it through the pelvis and out of the birth canal. Okay, and so you have this kind of happy birth weight where mom's healthy, baby's healthy, right? And that's a stabilizing factor. Okay, so just again, this is stabilizing, right? But let's say that you have these same mice, let's go back to our mice, and you have a dark brown soil, like really dark brown. You're going to start selecting for the darkest mice, and you will select against the blonde mice, right? And that is directional selection. Now, on the other hand, you could also select for, let's say you live in the beach, as we've seen, you could select for blonde mice and against dark mice, and so you could actually shift in the other direction too. So directional selection is shifting towards one end of the bell curve of the phenotype or the other. Okay, and so in this diagram we're shifting towards the dark mice, but we could have just as easily been shifting towards the blonde mice against the dark mice depending on the habitat. Okay, this is directional selection. And some examples of directional selection in the human population, a really great one is lactose tolerance. It turns out that lactose tolerance is only in about a little over a third of the population, but it is so amazingly successful that populations that were lactose tolerant, that spread through the population really quickly. And most of the individuals within those populations, there were 4 populations that had lactose tolerance arise in them independently. So 4 different populations, 1 in Africa and 3 in Europe. Within a very short period of time, all of the people, most of the people, not all the people, but most of the people in those groups were lactose tolerant after a couple of generations, because it's great to be able for kids to continue drinking milk. It's really healthy, right? And that's awesome, and most mammals do that, but it's also really healthy for adults. And so being able to consume milk after you become an adult is really successful. Yeah. Now, we also directionally select for other species, right? And we'll be talking about pressures that we place on other species in the environment. But just an example is when you think about hunting, we like to hunt deer that have big antlers, right? And so if you hunt those deer before they have the opportunity to breed several times, then you may end up with a population that ends up with smaller and smaller antlers, right? Domestication, we're selecting for certain traits, right? Maybe higher meat content, fat, more kernels, whatever, right? Pesticides push, and we'll talk about antibiotics too, because antibiotics do this as well. But pesticides will result in oftentimes the resistant ones because you killed all the less hardy ones, okay? That's all directional selection. And again, we'll talk about this more, this human pressure. Anthropogenic means human. We'll talk about that more later. All right, the last kind is where you select for both extremes and or against the middle, right? And this is disruptive or diversifying selection. Disruptive or diversifying selection. And one of the examples you see there is actually sexual dimorphism, right? You have, you're selecting for these traits, males versus females, right? And so you've got females have these traits, males have these traits, and you can start to see that in also the human population as well over time, okay? Now, most selection is directional, true or false? So a lot of the examples that we use when we talk about selection, they are directional, and so it would seem like most selection is directional, but that is actually false. You have all of the different types of selection going on, all the time equally the same pretty much. I mean, you can't say, oh, most of it is this, that it doesn't work like that. But the examples for selection, a lot of those that we use, those are some of the best examples to help you understand natural selection. So you just see them more. All right, let's talk about isolation. How do we split populations? Now, I already talked about this, allopatric versus sympatric speciation. So here is the stuff that I talked about before, right? But I wanted to add to it, for allopatric speciation, you simply just have populations that are isolated and so they can't share genes. But for sympatric, you see a lot of that disruptive selection going on in sympatric speciation, and I think that's an interesting thing, okay? Now, when we talk about isolating mechanisms, you've got prezygotic and postzygotic. So before you make an egg and then after you make an egg. So for prezygotic, obviously allopatric speciation occurs with the geographic isolation. You can also have ecological isolation. Even if you live in the same place, you may not come in contact with one another. Like, maybe you live in the top of the trees. You're a little rodent, and then other rodents that live on the ground, you are not going to come in contact with each other. Temporal isolation is that even if you do come in contact, you can't mate because you breed at different times. The autumn crocus versus the spring crocus. The autumn crocus flowers in fall. That's when it reproduces. The spring crocus flowers in the spring, and that is when it reproduces, so they can't do that. Now, even if you breed at the same time, you have to be attracted to the other one, right? So males are attractive to the females do the selecting. But if they're not attracted to the male, they're not going to mate with them. So if you can't sing the right song, or if you don't have the right color feet, or whatever, that's a behavioral isolation. And then there's the mechanical isolation. Even if you can attract a mate, if you're not physically compatible, that's just not going to work out. And I feel like I don't have to explain that. Okay, but if you have any questions, let me know. All right, so postzygotic, so let's say that geography works, ecology works, timing works, behavior is good, and everything else works, right, physiologically. The gametes, the sperms cannot merge with the egg. They can't fuse. It does not work. And even if you do get the egg and the sperm to fuse and you form a zygote, then we've got our mule, right? It's called hybrid inviability or infertility. And then you get hybrids, but they either are unhealthy, they can't produce eggs on their own. When they mate, their offspring are frail, right? Sterile, whatever. And then you just don't get anything. So mule's a really good example of that. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthals, we actually used to think that there was like a hybrid situation and you had this hybrid infertility. But we now know that anyone whose lineage arises outside of Africa has some percentage of Neanderthal genes. So clearly that was a hypothesis that we thought was true, but it seems to have worked out. And so that brings into question how closely related were we, and does that change the definition of species? And this is one of those this is where that definition of species breaks down, like it does with the polar bear, grizzly bear. They have that geographic isolation, but how does that call into question species? We let it stand that grizzly bears and polar bears are different species, that dogs and wolves are different species, even though big dogs and wolves can still interbreed. Little dogs and wolves can't. Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, even though it's clear we did interbreed, we still maintain those species differences, and that has to do with genetics, right? So you've got some interbreeding populations, but we're not changing those as species because it falls within the genetic definition of different species. Okay, does that make sense? And so this is where those lines blur, and hybrids make it very hard sometimes to say these are different species or not, and that's how you get into subspecies and stuff like that. Neanderthal is not a subspecies. We are not subspecies together. We are totally different species, and we'll talk about Neanderthal later on in the course. Okay, so which of the following would be most likely to produce a successful hybrid, but probably wouldn't? Coyote and wolf, a chimpanzee and human, orangutan and a baboon, a bobcat and a cougar. Okay, so, right, chimpanzees and humans have different numbers of chromosomes. That's not working out, even though we are really closely related. We're both great apes. Orangutans are great apes. Baboons are monkeys. They're completely different groups. I mean, they're all primates, but they're different groups. Bobcats and cougars, both felines, but again, they're different genuses. And then coyotes and wolves, they're both canids, right? They are the same genus, but they're different species. And it turns out that, remember, as you go through classification, the closer you get to those more exclusive groups like species, the more genetically related you are, right? And so genus, everybody in the same genus are much more closely related than groups that are just in the same family, for instance, but different genuses. So coyotes and wolves really still very closely related, and as a matter of fact, they are so closely related they actually do produce a successful hybrid, and it is called the Texas or Mexican red wolf. They are endangered partly because we've gotten rid of wolves, and so there aren't any wolves to breed with the coyotes, but that's a very interesting thing, and we didn't figure out that the Texas red wolf was a coyote wolf hybrid until relatively recently. Okay. And the reason I put but probably wouldn't is because there just aren't enough wolves for that to happen anymore. Okay. All right. So speciation by chromosome number. This is really important in animals. Now in plants, this is not true. But in animals, you have to have the same number of chromosomes in order to produce viable offspring. Again, not so much in plants, but in animals that is true, okay? Now, in plants, getting different numbers of chromosome sets, this is called ploidy, we'll talk about it later on. This is actually a really common way you get new species in flowering plants. They just simply start collecting more sets of their own chromosomes, okay? And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about genetics. So let's talk about how this works in terms of time, right? So how does speciation work in terms of time? There is the gradualistic model that says you get the steady rate of small changes that stack up over time, and so for a while, you're really closely related, you start getting more different and more different and more different, and this is actually supported by both genetics and the fossil record. Now, there's another hypothesis about it that's called punctuated equilibrium, and this is where you have periods of lots of speciation followed by periods with no noticeable evolution, and this is also true, Okay, you get these post-extinction events where you get this rapid speciation, like really fast, because you've all of these niches. But it turns out that you actually have both of these things. So there are certain events, these adaptive radiation events, that are punctuated equilibrium, and the rest of the time seems to be a gradualism kind of situation, the graduated equilibrium. Okay, so who is the last major successor of an extinction period? That would be mammals. Our last major extinction, 65 million years ago, gives rise to the age of mammals, class Mammalia. It's about 5,400 species. It's one of the most diverse groups because the continents are the most spread out that they've ever been. So we have lots and lots of different niches available. And it turns out that mammals pretty much are the dominant feature in most of those ecosystems. Okay, they inhabit every continent and every terrestrial biome, and some aquatic biomes, and they range in size from 1 inch to 100 feet. So you've got the bumblebee bat, which is about 1 inch, to the blue whale, which is about 100 feet. There are over 20 orders, 18 of which are still living. That's huge. And there are about 5,000, like I said, there are over 5,000 species. Rodents are the biggest order, followed by bats, and then followed by primates. So primates are the third largest order of mammals. Okay, so what are the characteristics of mammals? It is mammary glands, that's the milk producing. So whether you are a monotreme, which is a platypus and you lay eggs, you still produce milk, or a full placental mammal, right? And we'll talk about the different kinds of mammals in just a second. You've got hair, you are warm-blooded, that is endothermy. You have lungs with a diaphragm, you have a four-chambered heart. Now, four-chambered heart is also a bird thing, so that's not specific to mammals. Birds also have four-chambered hearts, okay? You have 3 middle ear bones. Your lower jaw is a single bone, unlike deer, for instance. We have diphyodonty, which is we have baby teeth and adult teeth. And we also have heterodonty, which means that we have specialized teeth. And we will talk about both of these things when we start talking about skulls later. Okay, so why isn't internal development on the list of those mammal characteristics? I mean, we get pregnant, the babies develop inside. I just forgot to put it there. It's ancestral to mammals. Mammals don't develop internally, and some mammals lay eggs. Well, like I just said, some mammals lay eggs, right? And that is the early mammals. So mammals actually appear about 210 million years ago during the Jurassic period. The earliest mammals were tiny insectivorous, right? Insectivores. They were monotremes, and those are egg-laying mammals, and they probably looked like little shrews. And they evolved from some mammal-like reptiles called cynodonts, and those evolved from therapsids, okay? And so the hair, by the way, is a modified scale. So those reptiles, those therapsids actually, and the cynodonts had this like hair-like scale transition stuff, okay? Then, right, recent evidence suggests that marsupial and placental mammals evolved around 120 million years ago. Now that predates the extinction of dinosaurs, so placental and marsupial mammals were around before the dinosaurs went extinct, although genetic evidence is kind of showing us that it's probably closer to 175 to 200 million years ago, okay? Fun fact, the oldest living group of mammals evolved around 110 million years ago in Africa, and that's going to include your elephants and manatees. Very cool, right? Now, in this early evolution of mammals, we get this massive adaptive radiation after the KT extinction, which is the extinction of dinosaurs. All of them are smaller than pigs until about 55 million years ago, and then you have that explosion. So it takes about 10 million years to get these really big mammals that you see today. And we've talked about the Yucatan impact earlier, right? So which trait would be the most helpful in surviving the global catastrophe that followed that Chicxulub asteroid impact 65 million years ago? Well, it turns out being warm-blooded, right? Because following that asteroid impact, you get cooling, right? And so being warm-blooded would allow mammals to stay active, right? To be able to search for food, all of that good stuff. Whereas that's not going to be true for your cold-blooded, your exothermic species, right? So endothermy there would be the best. All right, and then as we look at these changes, I just put this in here so you can kind of see our family tree. Monotremes arise first. They're the first mammals, okay? And then you get some modifications to the brain case, and then you get marsupials, and then you get the eutherians, which are the placental mammals, and you are a eutherian, right? Now, primates are the group that we're most interested in, because that's our group, and you'll have another set of video notes specifically about primates. But the prosimians are the first group. They evolve around the time the dinosaurs go extinct. They undergo that same adaptive radiation about 55 million years ago. And then after this, many of them actually became extinct when monkeys evolve, and we'll talk about why later on. And when this happens, most of Africa is a tropical forest, which makes sense. Monkeys are very arboreal. Then we start getting to see apes around 20 to 25 million years ago in the Miocene epoch. And when you start looking at the primate family tree, it looks something like this. And again, we'll be talking about our prosimian friends, our monkey friends, and our ape friends a little bit later on. All right, so if you have any questions, please let me know at the beginning of class. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.